Hello, this is Heath, and you are here for another episode of Media Diet Comics commentary, unscripted, unedited, just a guy talking about comics that he just read. Today, we're going to talk about Judge Dredd, specifically 3 comics, 2 issues of the Judge Dredd Megazine, and then a 2000 AD Sci-Fi Special from earlier in the year. And I like to think I knew about Judge Dredd before the Anthrax song I Am the Law came out in 1987, but I might have learned about him and the comic 2000 AD right around then. 2000 AD started in 1977. The Judge Dredd Megazine, which is what we're looking at today, this didn't start until about 1990. And it's slightly different than 2000 AD. So we're looking at two issues of Judge Dredd Magazine, number 418, which came out April 14th, 2020, and number 419, which came out May 15, 2020. So it's a monthly. And then the third comic we're going to be looking at is the 2000 AD Sci-Fi Special, which came out around June 24th of this year to celebrate 20 years of Rebellion publishing Judge Dredd. And the magazine is slightly different than 2000 AD. Both are anthology books. 2000 AD, I believe, is still weekly, whereas the magazine is monthly. And 2000 AD has been running continuously since 1977. The magazine just since 1990. And whereas 2000 AD focuses primarily on new stuff all the time, the magazine has, over time, included reprint stuff as well to keep costs down and to keep kind of the issue page count up. And what they've been doing lately is they've been publishing issues of the magazine, and I don't know if it's still the case, but at one time I know at least one of the story slots was dedicated to a creator-owned story. I don't know if that's the case anymore, but they have also been including reprint volumes bagged along with the comic. And so along with the 2 issues of the magazine that we'll be looking at today, we also have 2 reprint volumes of the story Black Shuck. And I'll talk about those separately because I consider them a separate item. But let's look at the 2 issues of the magazine. The magazine, when this came out, and the reason why the issues are so old is because of vagaries of comics distribution during the pandemic. It does take a while for things to get places, but also given that these are coming from England, there tends to be some delay in terms of when they hit our shores. It's not like picking up a manga like Jump at a Japanese grocery here in LA where you can get it the week it came out in Japan. There usually is some lag. That said, there's usually not this much lag, as far as I know. These 2 issues just hitting me recently came out in April and in May, and that seems like a long time. The Sci-Fi Special came out a little more recently. Its cover date is June 24 to August 19, and so it's a little more recent, a little more shelf life, but still quite a bit of time to get to us. Regardless, these are the newest ones that I've seen. So they currently contain 5 stories. We've got a Judge Dredd story, a Devlin Waugh story, a Blunt 3 story, there's a Zombie Army story, and a Lawless story, which is another kind of Judge Dredd-like story, though not featuring Dredd specifically. And what I want to do is just start with the cover to number 418. It's drawn by Phil Winsald, and it's a absolutely beautiful painted wraparound cover. And so this might actually be the highlight of the issue. 419 is not a wraparound cover, so that doesn't happen all the time. But let's take a look at the stories. The Judge Dredd story was written by Arthur Wyatt, art by P.J. Holden, and for me, Judge Dredd is always the highlight. You get stuff like this, the different residential blocks with celebrity names or historical figure names, which are always kind of funny. This is actually a really interesting story. There's a drug that's related to fungal growths, and as you can see here, doesn't always go well for people. And so the Judge Dredd story is very much a highlight of this issue. That said, the Devlin Waugh story is also intriguing. And I've seen other Wah stuff. He's a vampire, scripted by Ale Scott and art by Mike Dowling. But in this story, it's kind of a revenge story. Someone who he somehow did wrong for over the years has come back to exact revenge, and has actually prepared himself quite well to be ready to exact revenge on a vampire, which might be a daunting task. And so it's an interesting story, a revenge story, kind of an eldritch evil summoning story. That is what the fella hopes to summon through all of this. And then kind of the debonair and fey vampire Devlin Wah. But the story gets a little weird because it also turns out that there is a demon possessing a dildo. And so you get this 2-page spread of a conversation between Wah and this possessed dildo, and it is quite humorous. And I'll leave it to the listeners or viewers' imagination to determine how, if this demon were to possess someone else, how such possession would occur. But I certainly did not expect that in my Judge Dredd magazine today. The Blunt 3 story also turns out to be a Judge Dredd related story. I see some shoulder epaulets of a judge, scripted by T.C. Eglinton and art by Boo Cook. It is a little more cartoony in its art style, a little more biological as well as technological, and you get some neat fun there. The looser art style, the more cartoony art style, kind of leavens the seriousness and the realism that we've had so far in the issue. And the Blunt 3 story is also worth reading, and we'll continue into the next issue. In the previous episode of Media Diet Comics Commentary, I think I mentioned Action. It recently is being brought back kind of in a retro manner. Action was originally banned because of its content. I think one cover actually mentioned the word suicide 3 times before the comic was banned. And so that opens up then the editorial content outside of the comics for this issue. So the magazine content focuses mostly on other volumes published by Rebellion and other stuff going on in the comics scape. And so there's a 2-page article here about the Action 2020 special, in part a history of the original Action anthology comic. There's an article about the rise and fall of the Trigan Empire, Volume 1 reprint book. Has lovely kind of vintage art that they reproduce, kind of a highlight of such articles like that in the magazine. And then the third article is about Judge Dredd False Witness, which seems to be a new comic series from IDW. So it brings us back to IDW, who we've commented on in recent episodes. So the editorial content is all about other comics in terms of articles, but in this issue the article about Action is perhaps the most notable because it takes a look at the history of the series as well as the return of the series. Zombie Army is pretty straight ahead zombie fare, script by Chris Roberson and art by Andrea Moody. Pretty decent dark art. You can see the color palette here. Military, ruins of a city, someone who's either possessed or wearing a mask or a helmet of some kind, but your basic undead story with zombies that move relatively quickly. And that brings us to the last story, another Judge Dredd story, and perhaps my favorite. It's scripted by Dan Abnett, who's been writing Judge Dredd for quite some time. Art by Phil Winslade, who we saw did that beautiful wraparound cover. And just black and white, really inked well. A lot of hatching, some balancing with the whites. Not every page as dark, but relatively dense black and white art. And I really appreciate this. Not only do I like Winslade's art, and not only do I really like Judge Dredd and the judges as a character, But the black and white art takes me back to when I first encountered Judge Dredd in the pages of 2000 AD, when it was still newsprint. And so I thought I had changed my timeout timing, but there we go. So it times out at 10 minutes, and I'll have to turn that out. I thought I extended it to 30 minutes. Regardless, that's number 418, Judge Dredd Megazine. Let's move on then to number 419. You can see here we've got the Devlin Waugh character taking the cover, and it's the same 5 stories. A Judge Dredd story again continuing the previous serial, Devlin Waugh continuing, Blunt 3 continuing, Zombie Army continuing, and then the Lawless story continuing at the end. The kind of fungal growth drug story continues, develops nicely. This one is a good story, and I think will collect pretty well. The Devlin Waugh story continues. Really creepy moments in this story where some people that he had lost, friends he had lost, return from the dead, and he actually has to decide with his demon possessor friend how to get rid of them as a threat. So that continues, and the revenge story kind of comes to a head and takes a tumble. The Blunt 3 story continues. The biological technological threat is explained. You get some interesting double helix stuff going on. Again, Lucy, more cartoony art, a little more humor, and then we're into the editorial content. The highlight of the editorial content in this issue is a new book collection edited by David Roach called Masters of British Comic Art. You can see the cover of that here. And so there's an article on this new book. So if you're interested in the history of British comics, especially through its art, this interview with David Roach will expand on some of the highlights that you can look for there. And there's also a review of the Core Buster Easter Special, which is from the comic Buster. It's more like Beano. You can see, I believe, in that you actually... No, there's not. I thought, anyway, that Millie character made me think of the British Dennis the Menace. But there's a review of that Easter Special, which again reminds us how old this is. Came out in mid-May. There's an article about another comic, Boom Studios, Alienated, another connection to a previous episode of these comics commentaries. Boom also kind of a pipeline for British reprints. Another Zombie Army story continuing, the military ruined city, trying to dispatch the threat. They commandeer a vehicle. It doesn't really go well for everybody. And then we reach the end, and it continues the serialization of Lawless with more relatively dense, somewhat hatchy, black and white art by Phil Winslade. And the scene of this story is, I don't know the name of this character, but this just wonderful, wonderful sequence of art. And so that is that. That's the 2 issues of the magazine as magazines. Now remember that it's an anthology book and they're serialized. And so if you pick up other issues and there's some space in between them and the issues that I've commented on, the story will have progressed, or you'll be before the story where it is now. But I think it's worth picking up. I mean, the 2 Judge Dredd stories alone, the front of the book story and the Lawless story at the end, make it worth reading. The Devlin Waugh story is kind of a curveball. I've actually really been enjoying that. And even though I don't like zombie stuff too much, the Zombie Army's not turning me off too much. And the Blunt 3 story, is also really interesting. And just the art difference makes that worthwhile as well. So that takes us to the 2 reprint volumes. Each reprint volume is bagged with an issue of the magazine. And so these 2 are reprints of Black Shuck. And so this first volume reprints from 2000 AD issues 1712 and 1891 to 1899. So that comes to us from 2010 and 2014. The second volume reprints from numbers 1983 to 1992. So that's 2016. And let's see how that falls into sequence. So they are in order, but it takes Black Shuck stories from the pages of 2000 AD and puts them together into standalone volumes. And that's something that happens, is that 2000 AD tends to lead to reprint volumes. The magazine tends to lead to reprint volumes. That's not uncommon with anthology books. And so these are kind of a low-cost way to approach that. I think there are probably also nicer hardcover album style reprints. But the basic story of Black Shuck is that it's kind of a medieval period. Let's actually Scandinavia, 813 AD. Viking raiding parties continue to besiege the coasts, and so that's the time period in which it takes. But Black Shuck seems to be some kind of lycanthrope, and that's known from the offset, and so I don't really reveal too much. But it's kind of a story of his adventures, trials, and tribulations over time, different spots in history, because he also seems to be relatively long-lived. And then at the end of volume 2, I think it's the end of volume 2, it looks like he encounters some kind of spirit creature who might embody his lycanthropy. And so it's a pretty decent read, written by Lee Moore, John Reppion, and T.C. Eglinton, whose name we've already heard today, and art by Steve Yeowell, and then the second volume, Lee Moore and John Reppion, so no Eglinton, and then more Steve Yeowell. The art's good enough. I wouldn't say the art's the highlight. The story is interesting. Kind of a neat example of how, if you're really into a story that's serialized in an anthology book, a collection like this can work well. But if you're not, it might not be your thing. So if you really like Black Shuck, these will be really cool. If you didn't really like Black Shuck, they're kind of an insert or an inclusion with the comic that you bought that you're not really interested in. And so if I were to say from the issues of the magazine, clearly anything Judge Dredd collected is worth looking at. I think that the Holden art and the Arthur Wyatt story with the Bad Sector storyline will be worth collecting. I think Devlin Waugh is probably worth collecting if it hasn't been already. And then the Phil Winslade Lawless story is actually really, really, really cool. And so if I were to hope that those would be collected, that would actually not be a bad thing to see. And so this one's going a little long, and so I want to wrap it up soon, but let's take a look at the 2000 AD Sci-Fi Special. So this came out in late June and is specifically intended to celebrate 20 years of Rebellion publishing Judge Dredd. And so this is a mix of new stuff as well as reprints. We've got a new story from L. Ewing and Jake Lynch, Judge Dredd the Immigrant. It's basically about an immigration intake for a zombie. And so you get some neat kind of comedic, looks like a 12-panel page exchange there, ending with Judge Dredd deadpan saying, "Are you trying to be funny?" We've got some reprint stuff in here as well. We've got a story by L. Ewing and Dom Reardon that originally ran in 2002. Wonderful, wonderful story. Kind of a serial killer story, but also with some kind of viral information, visual cue story as well. There's an interview, I think, with the editor of Rebellion. Let's see, what other some highlights? The reprints are some of the more interesting. There's a Sinister Dexter piece from 2000, written by Dan Abnett and drawn by Andy Clark, that kind of looks at the concept of bullet time from an interesting comics point of view, and just the value or devalue of bullets as individual objects and items. There's another reprint from 2010, Nikolai Dante. And so this kind of hit me hot and cold. I mean, again, I really like the Judge Dredd stuff. I really enjoyed that kind of visual, viral serial killer story. I quite like the art in this Storm Warning story. Clint Langley, just look at those colors. Just wonderful, painted, density there, interesting color palette. You can kind of see some of the additional approach there. It's almost like airbrushing with my limited art knowledge, and my camera blanked out again. This is the unedited part of the show. But not all the reprint stuff actually really matters. The thing about ants possessing people on the island, that's actually a really cool story. That's actually new. The Red Seas versus Ant Wars. Ian Edginton, script, Steve Yeowell, art. So we're back to Yeowell, who did the Black Shuck stuff. But it's definitely about celebrating 2 decades of rebellion, being the publisher of Judge Dredd. And so that's worth recognizing. They've done a good job shepherding the character set. There's an article, 20 Thrills for 20 Years. Carl Stock kind of looks at what he thinks are the 20 best stories of Rebellion's 20 years. And so that might be worth looking at. But I think the highlight of this issue, with my comments about the kind of hot and cold value of the reprints, depending on whether you liked the story, the highlight of this issue for me is a 2002 reprint written by John Wagner, drawn by Carlos Esguerra. And if you recognize those names, they are the creators of Judge Dredd. And so they came back together to do a story in 2002 to recognize the character's 25th anniversary. And that's reprinted and included in here as well. So if you missed that in the original 2002, 2000 AD, it's worth checking out. It's a pretty standard street crime apartment block story. Judge Dredd intervening. It's actually kind of a funny look into his personal life, the apartment that he rents and lives in being turned over to another judge. That really excites the kind of the block committee because they think that this Judge Dredd guy's no good, and then it turns out the other judge is actually his clone, so he's no better. But that story is absolutely beautiful, and I want to thank those 2 gentlemen for creating Judge Dredd so many years ago. So thank you, John Wagner, and thank you, Carlos Esguerra, because you've given me and so many other people wonderful joy. And thank you, Rebellion, for continuing to publish the stuff. 2000 AD Sci-Fi Special, not an annual as far as I know, but kind of a memorial or commemorative edition. Judge Dredd Megazine, worth checking out on an ongoing basis, if not just for the front and back Judge Dredd stories and the current run of The Devil in Wa. The other 2 don't do as much for me, but well worth reading. And just one last look at that beautiful wraparound cover. If you get stuff like that every so often, that's well worth picking up too. So sorry for the long episode, longest one I've done so far. Judge Dredd Megazine, number 418, 419, 2 Black Shuck reprint volumes, and then the 2000 AD Sci-Fi Special. If you haven't checked out Judge Dredd recently, still in print, still worth checking out. Tons of reprint volumes as well, but the new programs, the 2000 AD, come out every week. The magazine comes out every month, and the new stuff is worth keeping up with. Have a great day.